So, here we are, my friends. The first significant moment in broadcast media is the print revolution. What I'm going to do in this video is take you through this really important origin of mass media broadcasting. We're going to look at the development of mechanical type printing as that mass medium and its impact upon the early modern world. So we're going to go right into this, and it's very McLuhanist, but I'll go on to the McLuhanist aspect of it in the next video after we've gone through the history part, because it is important to note that the development of the printing press takes place within a history of writing. So the movement from oral societies where there was no writing, knowledge, beliefs and ideas were held in stories and recounted in storytelling, poems, acting, rituals. That was an oral society. You move on to a literate society, which is basically what we've had since the mid part of the 15th century. There was a literate society before the 15th century, though. The invention of writing created literate society. You have the role of the phonetic alphabet within that in order to encode words, but it was mostly handwriting. And then when we move into printing, you see a boom in literacy, and the foundations of society themselves change with the formation of a literate society post the printing press. So how did writing start, you may ask? Take us back to the beginning. Well, early scribes wrote in Latin on rolls, which we call volumen of papyrus, a paper made from papyrus plants. The papyrus was very costly, very fragile. You could only write on one side of it. The scrolls were very difficult to use. They were very difficult to store. Very prone to not lasting very long. Now, writing was transformed with the development of parchment, which was used in the West by the 9th century AD. Parchment looks like this. There's your parchment. Parchment was made from animal skin. Oh yeah, all the vegetarians and vegans on the video now have just gone, ah! Yes, writing was done on animal skins, usually calf skins, though sheep, goat, other animals could be used for this. High quality parchment was called vellum, which was made from the very young or stillborn calves. Yeah, it's grim, it's gross, yeah. Now the advantages of using parchment like this was it was flat, it was stronger, in which it could be used on both sides and would last longer. It allowed goose quills to be used better than a rush breed and held ink better on the surface, and could be folded and sewn together in a book, which were called codex. Now, parchment-based writing was largely controlled by the church. Medieval book production was dominated by the church. These were hand-copied, illuminated texts written in Latin, bound into a codex, produced by monasteries for the church, plus for the court and for the wealthy. And it was actually an important source of income for the church in those times as well. But what you have here is what we call classically an epistocracy, a knowledge-based elite in a society. Now, we have epistocracies today. For example, the world of computers and computer science is largely an epistocracy. If you don't know how to code, so if you don't have that knowledge base, then it doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense to you. Back in these days, reading itself was an epistocracy. You had to be part of a particular class in society, or you had to be part of a particular group in society to even have access to books. If you didn't have access, what was the point in reading? You never even learned to read. There was no actual point in it because you've never come into contact with the written word anyway. So an epistocracy developed around the production of and distribution of books prior to the printing press. Now, the production of books was extremely laborious. There was a huge set of division of labours within this. You needed a tannery to produce the leaves. You needed somewhere to kill the animals and transform these skins into something. Librarians kept copies of the text, so you had a huge field of work in libraries. Senior monks read text to rooms. You literally had people called readers who would read out, and they were copied by scriptors upon line guidelines for lines and letters made by novices. So scriptor could average actually 4 leaves a day, with the day only interrupted by prayers. And several copyists worked on each book. All of these people were anonymous because it was for the glory of God, not for self. the church didn't give much credit to those people who actually produced the books, and they were largely they were largely monks or other religious orders like that as well, who didn't get any credit for actually producing the work that they did. They were illustrated by illuminators and miniaturists, and sewn and bound up by bookbinders with leather covers and metal clasps. So books at that time, beautiful artifacts though they were extremely laborious, slow to produce, and very, very limited in what could be done with them, and they were largely copies of other books as well. So obviously, you're thinking here, what book would be copied? Well, it was the Bible, right? Most scribes would be involved in copying out pages of the Bible to produce extra copies of Bibles to be distributed. And of course, this met largely with the aims of the church to retain its position as the key source of knowledge in society at that point in time. If the only book you could read was the Bible, you were only getting a certain biblical version of events, right? Of course, there were huge problems with this model, right? So it was extremely expensive to produce books. 300 calf skins for a Bible. Wow. Think of all those calves. It was very labor intensive and time to produce, limited production and numbers of copies. There was extreme limits on what you could produce in the timescales that you had to work in. Always risks of errors from hand copying, and there were frequent errors. Errors were then passed on to new copies. This led authorities to keep trying to find the best sources for new copies. It did lead to sort of some people being considered better than others, so you had a hierarchy going on, but the errors would become encoded over time. The choice of what was copied was always in the church's hands, so you had a very limited set of texts. Pagan texts, for example, were suppressed or opposed or modified to fit better with Christian doctrine. But the beauty of calligraphy, illustration of letters, illumination of borders, these maintain and stay on with us, and the robustness of the books of those times illustrates how great these books were in terms of those aspects. Now, paper was a big game changer. It initially was developed in China, made from rags and plant fibers, dating back to at least the 2nd century BC, so it's been around a long time. From the 6th to 12th century, paper spread through the Middle East and to North Africa, reached Spain by the sort of 11th to 20th century, and France, and Europe started to develop water-powered paper mills after its arrival in Spain and France in the 11th and 12th century. Paper was made from recycled cotton and linen until 1850, when they used trees. So it's a misnomer. Some people think paper's always been made out of felled trees. No, not until really 170 years ago. Really, that process started. Huge trade therefore arises in rags. Getting old pieces of clothing off people which are no longer usable becomes a trade in itself, because those can be traded to paper mills in order to create paper. They become a valuable commodity in themselves. So you've got another trade emerges out of the paper industry. Production expanded with the development of printing in a massive way. The printing press powered paper as an industry. Now, early printing was not a Western invention. From the 5th century, actually, ideas of stamp pressing letters onto paper led to the first books using carved block pages. It was largely in Eastern Asia. So by the 10th century, China was using movable type, which was a vital invention that we're going to see very shortly. Eventually, metal letters would be used, and rudimentary printing presses were developed, for example, in Korea in the 1230s, hundreds of years before Europe got to this. By the 15th century, Korea printed 308 books, half using the movable type thing. So actually, the printing press developed in Korea and China a lot earlier than it developed in Europe. But you can ask why it didn't succeed there. Well, writing systems were far too complex and conservative for the printing press. The symbols were very hard to reproduce in terms of metal pieces that could be used on a page to imprint a symbol. Paper that they had in China and Korea was far too thin. It was very brittle. It wasn't suited to the printing process. They lacked organized print technologies. Printing was also very expensive, and there was a lack of an economic system and a very limited market for this in China and Korea at the time. Across Asia, you also had major cultural differences. Indeed, at that time, Islam was largely an oral culture. So there was no real interest in the printing press across a lot of the area, a lot of Asia. And the idea of serial mass production just wasn't there. Nobody saw a business case for actually doing this anymore. So it was a curiosity in Asia. So China, Korea, they established the technologies for printing, but they never really consolidated it. It's almost like they didn't know what they had at the time, and there wasn't a need for it in those societies. All of these things were brought together by Johannes Gensfleisch Zuladen zum Gutenberg. And there is the great man himself, Johannes Gutenberg, an incredibly important man. Just about the most important man we're going to encounter in this module, I would argue. He invented this, the hand screw press, where you have a dude with a lever, a printing block, a screw. The dude moves the screw around and he pushes something down onto the paper, and they take the paper out and they put another piece in, and then they put it out and they put another piece in, and which meant you could mass produce pages and pages of text very, very quickly. The key to understanding the influence of the printing press is that it meant that all those problems you had with early books, slow to produce, very laborious process, it efficiently got rid of all of those things and made book printing into an incredibly efficient way of, industry. And in doing that, print and indeed, reading explodes, because now you actually have materials out there. By having them out there, people are motivated to learn to read, and therefore they do, etc., etc. This is actually what the Gutenberg press would look like. This is a photo I took of one a few years ago. You can find numerous examples of them around in museums and so on. So, what did Gutenberg do once he invented his press? His first book, a Latin grammar book, about 1450. Now, Gutenberg was a businessman producing for profit and targeting particular markets. So, he wasn't a benevolent soul trying to recreate knowledge for the whole of humankind. He was actually a businessman. He saw instantly the benefits of a number of copies, error-free production, and quality of letters. So the quality was better, there was less errors, indeed there should be no errors, and you could print a lot at the same time. And he found an investor called Johann Fust, who helped him develop the printing press, make more and more printing presses in order to make a viable business out of this. The first major book with movable type was his masterwork, the 42-line Bible, called so because there were 42 lines on a page. It's the first standardized production of a Bible. Everything else had been copied from handwritten copies previously. This is a standardized Bible which was pushed out, and Gutenberg knew his market. 1450, people want to read the Bible. He made it simple to read the Bible by mass producing the Bible for the first time. Now, there was a market for this, of course. So the church desire for standard error-free Bible was clear. Different translations and errors also led to conflicts, both internally and internally within the church, and how church scripture was interpreted, and externally as well. So, you could standardize the Bible, you standardize the meaning, you standardize the message. Could be produced now in large numbers, but needed to compete with the beauty of the scribal copies. So it became a hybrid work where, the printing press could quite easily handle illustration and so on. So you combine printed text with hand illuminations and so on, and which could be printed on as well. And this started to power a spread of printing, what we would call a media revolution. Now, there were 30,000 titles, which relates to about 15 to 20 million books published from 1450 to 1500. So after Gutenberg had started the printing press in 1450, you get about 20 million books in the next 50 years. You got 150 to 1.5 million to 2 million titles, and another 150 million to 200 million books published in the next 100 years. The acceleration of publishing books and the amount of books available just blows up straight away. It's unheard of quantities. They're all cheap, they're uniform, they're identical to one another. There's no errors in them, there's no production fallacies in them. These are incredible numbers of things, and it starts to spread a revolution around Europe. People start to read, and they don't just start to read the Bible. 30,000 titles. 1.5 million to 2 million titles. Okay, they're not all Bibles, by the way. You know, there's a huge explosion of ideas, there's an explosion of different viewpoints, etc., etc., which starts to challenge the Catholic Church and its dominance, and I will get into that in video 3. In the UK, we had printing too, and William Caxton was the first printer of any note in the UK. Unsure about when exactly he was born, but we know he died in 1492. He was a British merchant and diplomat. He learned the art of printing in Germany. Produced the first book in English in 1741, and he published it in Europe because he wasn't allowed to publish it in the UK. This is stuff I'll get into in week 2, by the way. 1476, he established the first British printing press at Westminster. So we were about 25 years behind Germany, but there was early on a emergence of a printing press in the UK too. Okay, video 3 will take us through what the significance of this all was.